Paddington Bear came to England from darkest Peru by stowing away on a ship. This must have happened about 1956 or 7, because it was in 1958 that the writer, Michael Bond, began to publish his stories about Paddington's adventures. Paddington was found, of course, on Paddington Station by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, and they took him back to their London home to live with them and their 2 children, Judy and Jonathan, and their housekeeper, Mrs. Bird. Paddington settled down quickly and made friends and did a good deal of travelling in and around London and to the country and the seaside. Now, though, he's going further afield, for these stories all come from the book called Paddington Abroad.
Paddington was in a mess. As he was the sort of bear who often got himself into trouble, he wasn't really surprised. But as he stood up and looked round his bedroom, even he had to admit that it was worse than usual. There were maps and pieces of paper everywhere, not to mention several nasty-looking marmalade stains and a long trail of paw prints. The paw prints started on a map which was spread across the eiderdown on his bed. It was a large map of London, and in the middle, by the first paw print, there was a circle which marked the position of the Browns' house at number 32, Windsor Gardens. The trail led from the Browns' house across the map in a southerly direction, over the end of the bed and onto another map which lay on the floor at the foot. From there it carried on, still going south, until it reached the English Channel, and yet a third map by the window which showed the north coast of France. There the trail ended in a soggy mess made up of old cake crumbs, a small pile of marmalade, and a blob of red ink. Paddington gave a deep sigh as he dipped his paw absent-mindedly into the concoction. He tried kneeling on the floor and peering at his room through half-closed eyes, but if anything, the mess looked even worse, because from so low down all he could see were the bumps and ridges. Just as he was about to lie back and consider the matter, he was suddenly brought back to life by the sound of clinking plates and footsteps on the stairs. Jumping up with a guilty expression on his face, Paddington hurriedly began sweeping everything under the bed. Although he had some very good explanations for the mess he was in, he felt sure that neither Mrs. Brown nor Mrs. Bird would be very keen on hearing them, especially at breakfast time, when everyone was usually in a great hurry. "Are you awake, Paddington?" called Mrs. Brown as she knocked on the door. "No, not yet, Mrs. Brown," cried Paddington in a muffled voice as he tried to push the marmalade jar under the wardrobe. I think my lids are stuck." Being a truthful bear at heart, Paddington closed his eyelids and snored several times while he gathered up the rest of his belongings. Feeling around for the pen and ink, he hastily put them into his old hat, which he pulled down over his head, and then, gathering up the last of the maps, he groped his way across the room. "Whatever's going on, Paddington?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown as the door suddenly opened and Paddington appeared. Paddington nearly fell over backwards with surprise when he saw Mrs. Brown standing there with his breakfast tray. I thought you were a cupboard, Mrs. Brown," he exclaimed, as he hurriedly put a pawful of maps behind him and backed towards the bed. I must have gone the wrong way by mistake." "I should think you did," said Mrs. Brown as she followed him into the room. "I never heard so much banging and crashing." Mrs. Brown looked suspiciously round the room, but everything appeared to be in its place, so she turned her attention back to Paddington, who was now sitting up in bed with a very odd expression on his face. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked, anxiously, as she placed the tray in front of him. For one nasty moment Mrs. Brown thought she saw a trickle of red running down Paddington's left ear. But before she could look into the matter, he'd pulled his old hat even further down over his head. All the same, she didn't like the look of it at all, and she hesitated at the door in case something was wrong. Paddington, in his turn, rather wished Mrs. Brown would hurry up and go. In his haste to clear up the mess, he'd forgotten to put the stopper back on the bottle of ink, and the top of his head was beginning to feel quite soggy. Mrs. Brown sighed as she closed the door. She knew from past experience it was hopeless trying to get an explanation out of Paddington when he was in one of his difficult moods. "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird when Mrs. Brown joined her in the kitchen and told her all about Paddington's strange behaviour, "if you ask me, that young bear isn't the only one in this house who's acting in a funny manner. It's all to do with you-know-what." Well, with that, Mrs. Brown had to agree. Things had been very much upside down in the Brown household ever since the previous evening. It had all started when Mr. Brown arrived home carrying a large pile of maps and brightly coloured pamphlets and announced that he was taking them to France for their summer holiday. In a matter of moments, the normal peace and quiet of number 32 Windsor Gardens had disappeared completely, never to return. The holiday had been the one topic of conversation from dinner time until last thing at night. Old beach balls and bathing costumes had been searched for in disused cupboards, plans had been discussed, and Mrs. Bird had already begun washing and ironing a small mountain of clothes ready for the big day. Paddington, in particular, had been most excited at the news. Since he'd been a member of the Brown family, they'd taken him on a number of day trips which he'd enjoyed no end, but he had never before been away for a real holiday, and he was looking forward to it. To add to his excitement, Mr. Brown, in a generous moment, had put him in charge of all the maps and a thing called an itinerary. At first, Paddington hadn't been at all sure about being in charge of anything which sounded so important as an itinerary. But after Judy had explained to him it was simply a list of all the places they would visit and the things they would do, he'd quickly changed his mind. Paddington was keen on lists, and a doings list sounded most interesting. "Mind you," said Mrs. Bird, darkly, as she discussed the matter with Mrs. Brown over the washing-up, "mind you, if that young bear's going to be in charge of the maps, we shall need all of a fortnight. It's asking for trouble. There's no knowing where we might end up." Mrs. Brown sighed again. "Oh, well," she said, turning her attention to other things, "at least it keeps him happy. You know how keen he is on writing things." Said Mrs. Bird. "It'll be all over the sheets if I know anything. Itineraries, indeed." She snorted and cast a dark glance up at the ceiling in the direction of Paddington's room on the second floor. Mrs. Bird knew from past experience and much washing of sheets that ink and Paddington were two things best kept apart. But as it happened, for once she needn't have worried, for Paddington had just that moment stopped writing. In fact, he was sitting up in bed, carefully studying a large sheet of drawing paper which he held in his paws. At the top of the paper, in big red capital letters, was the heading, "Itinerary by Paddington," followed by his special paw mark to show that it was genuine. The first item on the list was 7 o'clock, large breakfast. And then came 8 o'clock, leave home, 32 Windsor Gardens. 9 o'clock, snack. 11 o'clock, elevenses. Paddington read through the list several more times, and then, after adding the words 12 o'clock, arrive at airplane, lunch, he folded the paper and packed it away in the secret compartment of his suitcase. Planning a holiday, especially a holiday abroad, was much more complicated than he'd imagined, and he decided the only thing to do was to consult his friend Mr. Gruber on the subject. A few minutes later, after a quick wash, he hurried downstairs, collected the shopping list from Mrs. Bird and his basket on wheels, and disappeared out of the house with a purposeful gleam in his eyes. Pausing only to call in at the baker's, where he had a standing order for freshly baked buns, Paddington soon rounded the corner into the Portobello Road, and made his way in the direction of Mr. Gruber's shop, with its familiar windows bursting at the seams with antiques of every shape and size. Mr. Gruber shared Paddington's liking for cocoa and buns, and they often had long chats together over their elevenses. He had travelled a great deal in his younger days, and Paddington felt sure he would know all there was to know about holidays abroad. Mr. Gruber was just as excited as Paddington when he heard the news, and he quickly led the way to the horsehair sofa at the back of the shop, which he reserved for all their more important discussions. "What a nice surprise, Mr. Brown," he said, as he busied himself at the stove with the saucepan of milk. "I don't suppose there are many bears able to take their holidays abroad, so you must make the most of it. If there's anything I can do to help, you must let me know." Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all Paddington's explanations while he made the cocoa, and his face took on a serious expression. "I must say, being in charge of an itinerary sounds a heavy responsibility for a young bear's shoulders, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed as he handed Paddington a steaming mug of cocoa in exchange for a bun. "I shall have to see what I can do." And without further ado, he got down on his hands and knees and began sorting through a pile of old books in a box behind the sofa. "Everyone seems to be taking their holidays abroad at the moment, Mr. Brown," he said, as he began handing some of the books up to Paddington. "I've had rather a run on books about France, but I hope you'll find these useful." Paddington's eyes got larger and larger as the pile by his side got higher, and he nearly fell off his seat with surprise when Mr. Gruber suddenly stood up, holding an old black beret in his hands. "It's rather large," said Mr. Gruber apologetically, as he held it up to the light, "and there seem to be one or two moth-holes. But it's a real French one, and you're very welcome to it." "Thank you very much, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington gratefully. "I expect the moth-holes will do for my ears. Bears' ears don't fold very easily." "Well, I hope you find everything useful," said Mr. Gruber, looking very pleased at the expression on Paddington's face. "You'll need a lot of books if you're going to plan an itinerary, and it's as well to be on the safe side. You never know what might happen when you're abroad, Mr. Brown." Mr. Gruber went on to explain about some of the things Paddington would see while he was away, and it was some while before Paddington wiped the last of the cocoa stains from his whiskers and stood up to go. Time passed very quickly when he was with Mr. Gruber, because he always made things sound so much more interesting than other people did. "I expect you'll find lots to write in your scrapbook, Mr. Brown," said Mr. Gruber, as he helped Paddington load his shopping basket. "I shall look forward to reading all about it." Paddington felt more and more excited as he waved goodbye and staggered along the Portobello Road under the weight of all his belongings. The shopping basket was so heavy it was quite difficult to steer, and several times he nearly ran into one or other of the barrows which lined the street. Apart from that, there were so many things on his mind he didn't know which to think about first. He was particularly anxious to try out his new beret, and some of Mr. Gruber's books looked most interesting. In the end, he decided to sit down for a rest and investigate both. He put his old hat on the ground, carefully adjusted the beret, and then began taking the books out of his shopping basket one by one. First, there was a dictionary. Then there was a French cookery book, full of recipes and coloured pictures of food which made his mouth water. After that came one packed with maps and instructions about things to see and do, and this was followed by several more books full of pictures. Last of all, Paddington came to a very important-looking leather-bound volume which had the words Useful Phrases for the Traveller Abroad, written in gold letters on its cover. Before he took it out of the basket, Paddington hurried across the road and dipped his paws in a nearby horse trough. Mr. Gruber had explained that the book was very old, and he asked him to take especial care of it. When he returned, Paddington sat down again and began to examine the book. It was most unusual, and he didn't remember ever having seen one quite like it before. Just inside the front cover there was a drawing which showed what looked like a very old-fashioned car being drawn by 4 white horses, and it was full of sentences showing how to ask for things in French, with pictures explaining matters as it went along. In no time at all he became so lost in the book he quite forgot where he was. There was one particularly interesting phrase in a section marked Travel which caught his eye at once. It said, "My grandmother has fallen out of the stagecoach and needs attention." Paddington felt quite sure it would come in very useful if Mrs. Bird happened to fall out of Mr. Brown's car while they were going along, and he tested it several times, waving his paws in the air as the man in the picture seemed to be doing. To his surprise, when he looked up, Paddington discovered he was surrounded by a small crowd of people who were watching him with interest. "If you ask me," said one man, who was leaning on a bicycle studying Paddington intently, "if you ask me, I reckon he's one of them onion bears. They come over every year from Brittany," he added, knowledgeably as he turned to the crowd. "They has their onions on a piece of string. You must have seen 'em, that's why he was spouting French."
"Ah, go on," said another man. "That wasn't French. He was having some sort of spasm, waving his paws about something shocking he was besides," he added triumphantly. "If he's an onion bear, where's his onions?"
Perhaps he's lost them," said someone else. "That's why he's upset. I expect his string broke, if the truth be known."
"It's enough to give anyone a spasm," said a lady, "coming all this way and then losing your onions."
"That's what I said," explained the first man. "I expect he was having a French spasm. They're the worst of the lot. Very excitable, them foreigners."
"I shouldn't touch him, dear. You don't know where he's been," said another lady, turning to her small boy, who had his eye on Paddington's beret. Paddington's eyes had been getting larger and larger as he listened to the crowd, and he looked most offended at the last remark. "An onion bear?" he exclaimed at last. "I'm not an onion bear. I'm a going abroad bear, and I've just been to see Mr. Gruber." With that, he gathered up his belongings and hurried off up the road, leaving behind him a buzz of conversation. Rounding the corner into Windsor Gardens, Paddington gave the crowd several hard stares over his shoulder. But as he got nearer to the familiar green door of number 32, a thoughtful expression came over his face. And as he stood on the doorstep and heard the footsteps of Mrs. Bird coming along the hall, Paddington decided that perhaps it had been a very good morning's work after all. Thinking things over, he felt rather pleased at having been mistaken for a French bear, even if it had only been one who sold onions. In fact, the more he thought about the matter, the better pleased he became, and he felt sure that with the help of all the maps and pamphlets and Mr. Gruber's books, he would be able to plan some very good holiday doings indeed for the Browns. "Paddington looks unusually smart this morning," said Mrs. Bird.
"Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown.
"Does he? I hope he's not up to anything."
She joined Mrs. Bird at the window and followed the direction of her gaze up the road to where a small figure in a blue duffel coat was hurrying along the pavement. Now that Mrs. Bird mentioned it, Paddington did seem to have an air about him. Even from a distance his fur looked remarkably neat and freshly combed, and his old hat, instead of being pulled down over his ears, was set at a very rakish angle, with the brim turned up, which was most unusual. Even his old suitcase looked as if it had some kind of polish on it. "He's not even going in his usual direction," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington, having reached the end of the road, looked carefully over his shoulder, and then turned right and quickly disappeared from view. "He always turns left." "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "that young bear's got something on his mind. He was acting strangely at breakfast this morning. He didn't even have a second helping, and he kept peering over Mr. Brown's shoulder at the paper with a very odd look on his face." "Well, I'm not surprised he had an odd look if it was Henry's paper," said Mrs. Brown. "I can never make head or tail of it myself." Mr. Brown worked in the City of London, and he always read a very important newspaper at breakfast time, full of news about stocks and shares and other money matters, which the rest of the Browns found very dull. "All the same," she continued as she led the way into the kitchen, "it's very strange. I do hope he hasn't got one of his ideas coming on. He spent most of yesterday evening doing his accounts, and that's often a bad sign." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were hard at work, preparing for the coming holiday, and with only a few days left there were 1,001 things to be done. If they hadn't been quite so busy, they might well have put two and two together. But as it was, the matter of Paddington's strange behaviour was soon forgotten in the rush to get everything ready. Unaware of the interest he'd caused, Paddington made his way along a road not far from the Portobello Market until he reached an imposing building which stood slightly apart from the rest. It had tall, bronze doors which were tightly shut, and over the entrance, in large gold letters, were the words, "Floyd's Bank Limited." After carefully making sure that no one was watching, Paddington withdrew a small, cardboard-covered book from under his hat, and then sat down on his suitcase outside the bank while he waited for the doors to open. Like the building, the book had the words "Floyd's Bank" printed on the outside, and just inside the front cover it had "P. Brown, Esquire," written in ink. With the exception of the Browns and Mr. Gruber, not many people knew about Paddington's banking account, and it was a closely kept secret. It had all started some months before, when Paddington came across an advertisement in one of Mr. Brown's old newspapers which he cut out and saved. In it, a very fatherly-looking man smoking a pipe, who said he was a Mr. Floyd, explained how any money left with him would earn what he called interest, and that the longer he kept it, the more it would be worth. Well, Paddington had an eye for a bargain, and having his money increase simply by leaving it somewhere had sounded like a very good bargain indeed. The Browns had been so pleased at the idea that Mr. Brown had given him 20p to add to his Christmas and birthday money, and, after a great deal of thought, Paddington had himself added another 5p, which he'd carefully saved from his weekly bun allowance. When all these sums were added together, they made a grand total of £1.25p, and one day Mrs. Bird had taken him along to the bank in order to open an account. For several days afterwards, Paddington had hung about in a shop doorway opposite, casting suspicious glances at anyone who went in or out. But after having been moved on by a passing policeman, he'd had to let matters rest. Since then, although he carefully checked the amount in his book several times, Paddington had never actually been inside the bank. Secretly, he was rather overawed by the marble and the thick polished wood, so he was pleased when at long last 10 o'clock began to strike on a nearby church clock, and he was still the only one outside. As the last of the chimes died away, there came the sound of bolts being withdrawn on the other side of the door, and Paddington hurried forward to peer eagerly through the letterbox. "Here," exclaimed the porter, as he caught sight of Paddington's hat through the slit. "No hawker's ear, young fellow, my lad. This is a bank, not a workhouse. We don't want no hobbledehoys hanging around here." "Hobbledehoys?" repeated Paddington, letting go of the letterbox in his surprise. "That's what I said," grumbled the porter as he opened the door. "Breathing all over me knockers. I has to polish that brass, you know."
"I'm not a hobbledehoy," exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended as he waved his bank book in the air. "I'm a bear, and I've come to see Mr. Floyd about my savings." "Oh, dear," said the porter, taking a closer look at Paddington. "Begging your pardon, sir. When I saw your whiskers poking through me letterbooks, I mistook you for one of them bearded gentlemen of the road." "That's all right," said Paddington sadly. "I often get mistaken." And as the man held the door open for him, he raised his hat politely and hurried into the bank. On several occasions in the past, Mrs. Bird had impressed on Paddington how wise it was to have money in the bank in case of a rainy day, and how he might be glad of it one day for a special occasion. Thinking things over in bed the night before, Paddington had decided that going abroad for a holiday was very much a special occasion, and after studying the advertisement once again, he had thought up a very good idea for having the best of both worlds. But, like many ideas he had at night under the bedclothes, it didn't seem quite such a good one in the cold light of day. And now that he was actually inside the bank, Paddington began to feel rather guilty, and he wished he'd consulted Mr. Gruber on the matter, for he wasn't at all sure that Mrs. Bird would approve of his taking any money out without first asking her. Hurrying across to one of the cubbyholes in the counter, Paddington climbed up on his suitcase and peered over the edge. The man on the other side looked rather startled when Paddington's hat appeared over the top, and he reached nervously for a nearby inkwell. "I'd like to take out all my savings for a special occasion, please," said Paddington, importantly, as he handed the man his book. And looking rather relieved, the man took Paddington's book from him, and then raised one eyebrow as he held it up to the light. There were a number of calculations in red ink all over the cover, not to mention blots, and one or two rather messy-looking marmalade stains. "I'm afraid I had an accident with one of my jars under the bedclothes last night," exclaimed Paddington hastily as he caught the man's eye. "One of your jars?" repeated the man. "Under the bedclothes?" "That's right," said Paddington. "I was working out my interest, and I stepped back into it by mistake. It's a bit difficult under the bedclothes." "It must be," said the man distastefully. "Marmalade stains, indeed, and on a Floyd's bank book." He hadn't been with the branch for very long, and although the manager had told him that they sometimes had very odd customers to deal with, nothing had been mentioned about Bear's banking accounts. "What would you like me to do with it?" he asked doubtfully. "I'd like to leave all my interest in, please," explained Paddington, "in case it rains." "Well," said the man in a superior tone of voice as he made some calculations on a piece of paper, "I'm afraid you won't keep very dry on this. It only comes to 1.5p. "What?" exclaimed Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. 1.5p? I don't think that's very interesting." "Interest isn't the same thing as interesting," said the man. "Not the same thing at all." He tried hard to think of some way of explaining matters, for he wasn't used to dealing with bears, and he had a feeling that Paddington was going to be one of his more difficult customers. It's something we give you for letting us borrow your money," he said. "And the longer you leave it in, the more you get." "Well, my money's been in since just after Christmas," exclaimed Paddington. "That's nearly 6 months." 1.5p, said the man, firmly. Paddington watched in a daze as the man made an entry in his book, and then pushed a £1 note and some silver across the counter. "There you are," he said briskly. £1, 25p. Paddington looked suspiciously at the note, and then consulted a piece of paper he held in his paw. His eyes grew larger and larger as he compared the two. "I think you must have made some mistake," he exclaimed. "This isn't my note." "A mistake?" said the man stiffly. "We of Floyd's never make mistakes." "But it's got a different number," said Paddington hotly. A different number?" repeated the man. "Yes," said Paddington, "and it said on mine that you promised to pay Bear £1 on demand." "Not Bear," said the assistant, "Bearer. It says that on all notes. Besides," he continued, "you don't get the same note back that you put in. I expect yours is miles away by now, if it's anywhere at all. It might even have been burnt, if it was an old one. They often burn old notes when they're worn out." "Burnt?" repeated Paddington in a dazed voice. "You've burnt my note?" "I didn't say it had been," said the man, looking more and more confused. I only said it might have been." Paddington took a deep breath and gave the assistant a hard stare. It was one of the extra special hard ones which his Aunt Lucy had taught him and which he kept for emergencies. "I think I should like to see Mr. Floyd," he exclaimed. "Mr. Floyd?" repeated the assistant. He mopped his brow nervously as he looked anxiously over Paddington's shoulder at the queue which was already beginning to form. There were some nasty murmurings going on at the back which he didn't like the sound of at all. "Well, I'm afraid there isn't a Mr. Floyd," he said. "We have a Mr. Trimble," he added hastily, as Paddington gave him an even harder stare. "He's the manager, Mr. Trimble. I think perhaps I'd better fetch him. He'll know what to do." Paddington stared indignantly after the retreating figure of the clerk as he made his way towards a door marked Manager. The more he saw of things, the less he liked the look of them. Not only did his note have a different number, but he had just caught sight of those dates on the coins, and they were quite different to those on the ones he left. Apart from that, his own coins had been highly polished, whereas these were very old and very dull. Paddington climbed down off his suitcase and pushed his way through the crowd with a determined expression on his face. Although he was only small, Paddington was a bear with a strong sense of right and wrong, especially when it came to money matters, and he felt it was high time he took matters into his own paws. After he'd made his way out of the bank, Paddington hurried down the road in the direction of a red kiosk. Locked away in the secret compartment of his suitcase, there was a note with some special instructions Mrs. Bird had written out for him in case of an emergency, together with a 2p piece. Thinking things over as he went along, Paddington decided that it was very much a matter of an emergency. In fact, he had a job to remember when he'd had a bigger one, and he was glad when at long last the telephone kiosk came into view and he saw that it was empty. "I don't know what's going on at the bank this morning," said Mrs. Brown as she closed the front door. "There was an enormous crowd outside when I came past." "Perhaps there's been a robbery," said Mrs. Bird. "You read of such nasty goings-on these days." "I don't think it was a robbery," said Mrs. Brown vaguely. "It was more like an emergency of some kind. The police were there, and an ambulance, and the fire brigade." Said Mrs. Bird. "Well, I hope for all our sakes it isn't anything serious. Paddington's got all his money there, and if there has been a raid, we shall never hear the last of it." And Mrs. Bird paused as she was speaking, and a thoughtful expression came over her face. "Talking of Paddington, have you seen him since he went out?" she asked. "No," said Mrs. Brown. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "You don't think—" "I'll get my hat," said Mrs. Bird, "and if Paddington's not somewhere at the bottom of it all, I'll eat it on the way home." It took Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird some while to force their way through the crowd into the bank, and when they at last got inside, their worst suspicions were realized, for there, sitting on his suitcase, in the middle of a large crowd of officials, was the small figure of Paddington. "What on earth's going on?" cried Mrs. Brown as they pushed their way to the front. Paddington looked very thankful to see the others. Things had been going from bad to worse since he got back to the bank. "I think my numbers have got mixed up by mistake, Mrs. Brown," he explained. "Trying to do a young bear out of his life savings, that's what's going on," cried someone at the back. Set fire to his notes, they did, cried someone else. Hundreds of pounds gone up in smoke, so they say, called out a street trader who knew Paddington by sight and had come into the bank to see what all the fuss was about. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Brown nervously. I'm sure there must be some mistake. I don't think Floyd's would ever do a thing like that on purpose.
Indeed not, madam, exclaimed the manager as he stepped forward. My name's Trimble, he continued. Can you vouch for this young bear?
Vouch for him? Said Mrs. Bird. Why, I brought him here myself in the first place. He's a most respectable member of the family, and very law-abiding.
Yes, respectable he may be, said a large policeman as he licked his pencil, but I don't know so much about being law-abiding. Dialling 999 he was without proper calls, calling out the police, not to mention the fire brigade and an ambulance. It'll all have to be gone into in the proper manner. Everyone stopped talking and looked down at Paddington.
I was only trying to ring Mrs. Bird, said Paddington.
Trying to ring Mrs. Bird, repeated the policeman slowly as he wrote it down in his notebook.
That's right, explained Paddington. I'm afraid my paw got stuck in number 9, and every time I tried to get it out, someone asked me what I wanted, so I shouted for help.
Mr. Trimble coughed. I think perhaps we'd better go into my office, he said. It all sounds most complicated, and it's much quieter in there. With that, everyone agreed wholeheartedly, and Paddington, as he picked up his suitcase and followed the others into the manager's office, agreed most of all. Having a banking account was quite the most complicated thing he'd ever come across. It was some while before Paddington finally got through his explanations, but when he'd finished, everyone looked most relieved that the matter wasn't more serious. Even the policeman seemed quite pleased. "It's a pity there aren't more public-spirited bears about," he said, shaking Paddington by the paw. "If everyone called for help when they saw anything suspicious, we'd have a lot less work to do in the long run." "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, looking hard at her husband, "you wouldn't think that it would be possible to get lost in such a short space of time. We've only been in France half a day." "Are you sure you don't know where we are, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown for the umpteenth time. Paddington shook his head sadly. "I think we must have taken the wrong turning by mistake, Mr. Brown," he admitted. The Browns looked gloomily at one another. Until that moment, their first day in France had been very gay and exciting. With so many new things to see, the time had passed very quickly, and Paddington in particular had been kept busy following the route with his paw and making notes as they went along. Between the towns they'd driven along miles of straight country roads, lined on either side by tall poplar trees, and past tiny villages, full of men in blue overalls and women hurrying to and fro carrying long loaves of bread. Nicest of all, every now and then as they turned a corner, they'd had a glimpse of the blue sea and heard the distant roar of waves breaking on the shore. And then, as they crossed into Brittany, not only had the countryside gradually become much wilder, but things had started to go wrong as well. First, the wide black road had suddenly changed into a narrow lane covered in stones. Then the lane had become a cart track. Finally, the cart track had come to an end on a piece of common land, and as a final blow, the car had punctured one of its back tyres. Being in charge of the itinerary, Paddington felt very upset at what had happened, and he peered hard at the maps while the Browns gathered anxiously round him. "What was the name of the last place we went through, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown. "Perhaps that's where we went wrong." "I think it was called Gravilons, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. "But I can't see it on any of the maps." "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan suddenly as he looked up from his dictionary. "No wonder you can't find it on the map. Gravilons isn't a place, it's a road sign. It means loose chippings." "What?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "Loose chippings?" "That's where all those stones were," said Judy. "They must have been repairing the road." Mrs. Bird snorted. "Gravilons indeed," she exclaimed. "No wonder that poor bear went wrong. It's a mercy we didn't all end up in the sea." Mrs. Bird firmly believed that everything abroad should be written in good, plain English. "Oh, well," said Mr. Brown, as he folded the map, "at least we know where we're not, even if we don't know where we are." He looked down at the pile of luggage which hid the spare wheel in the boot of the car. "Everything will have to come out, so I vote we make the best of it and have a picnic while I change the wheel." "It's a good thing I brought some food along," said Mrs. Bird, as she opened her travelling bag and began to take out an assortment of tins and packets, together with a loaf of bread and some knives and forks. "I had a feeling we might need it." "I'll tell you what," said Mr. Brown. "We'll have a competition. You can each cook one of the courses, and I'll give a prize for the best one." "Whizzo!" exclaimed Jonathan. "Bags, we have a campfire." "I'll collect some wood if you like, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, waving a paw in the direction of a wood at the top of a nearby hill. "Bears are good at collecting firewood." "Don't go too far," called Mrs. Brown anxiously, as Paddington picked up his suitcase and hurried off. "We don't want you getting lost as well." But Paddington was already out of earshot. He was still feeling guilty that the Browns had lost their way, and he was anxious to make amends by gathering as much firewood as possible. So he hurried up the hill as fast as his legs would carry him. But, looking around and sniffing the air as he made his way across the springy turf, Paddington decided that perhaps being lost wasn't quite such a bad thing after all. To start with, there was a nice warm smell about everything which he liked very much indeed. It was an interesting smell, not at all like the one in England, or even in Peru for that matter. It seemed to be made up of coffee and newly baked bread, as well as several other things he couldn't quite place, and for some strange reason it was getting stronger every minute. It wasn't until Paddington reached the top of the hill and looked down over the other side that he discovered the reason for it. And when he did so, he had to rub his eyes several times in order to make sure he wasn't dreaming. For there, only a short distance away, at the bottom of the hill, and looking exactly like one of the pictures in Mr. Brown's pamphlets, was a cluster of houses. And beyond the houses he could see a beach and a small harbour full of boats. Running up from the harbour, there was a narrow street which led into a square where there were a number of gaily coloured stalls laden with fruit and vegetables. As he hurried down the hill into the village and made his way towards the square which he'd seen from the top of the hill, Paddington looked around with interest. He liked new places, and this one seemed particularly nice. On his right there was a large building with a veranda and a sign outside which said Hôtel du Centre, and on the other side of the square there was a post office and a butcher's shop, as well as several cafes and a grocery store. Best of all, next door to the hotel, he spied a baker's shop. Paddington liked baker's shops, and this one was most interesting, for it had loaves of every shape and size in its window, long ones, short ones, fat ones, round ones. In fact, he grew quite dizzy trying to count them all. After consulting Mr. Gruber's phrase book, Paddington made his way across the square in the direction of the shop. In the past, he'd often found bakers were most understanding as far as bears' problems were concerned. Mr. Gruber always said it was something to do with their sharing an interest in buns. But whatever the reason, Paddington decided he couldn't do better than pay the owner a visit and seek his advice about the surprise he had in mind for the Browns. Paddington's being very mysterious all of a sudden," said Mr. Brown, some while later. "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "that bear's got something up his paw. He was gone a very long time when he went for the firewood, and he's had a funny look on his face ever since." The Browns were in the middle of their meal, and there was a slight hold-up while Paddington prepared his contribution. Jonathan and Judy had already made some soup in Mr. Brown's billy-can, and Mrs. Bird had followed that with a special salad, which everyone had enjoyed enormously. There'd been rather a long pause when it came to Paddington's turn, and the Browns were beginning to get impatient. Paddington had explained that it was a very secret dish, and so they had to turn their backs on the campfire and promise not to look while he cooked it. There seemed to be a lot of stirring and clanking going on behind them, not to mention some very heavy breathing. But the smell which wafted on the breeze was certainly making their mouths water, and they were all looking forward to discovering what was his secret dish. Mrs. Brown cheated, and stole an anxious glance over her shoulder to where Paddington was bending over his saucepan. He had a large recipe book in one paw, and he appeared to be poking something cautiously with a stick while he sniffed it. "I hope he doesn't set light to his whiskers," she said. "He's awfully near the flames." "Doesn't smell like burning whiskers," said Mr. Brown. "In fact, I must say it smells rather good. I wonder what it is." "I bet it's got marmalade in it," said Jonathan. "Paddington's things always have marmalade." Fortunately for everyone's peace of mind, before they had time to think too much about it, Paddington stood up and announced that everything was ready and they could turn round. Mrs. Brown looked suspiciously at Paddington as they gathered round the saucepan. There were one or two gravy splashes sticking to his whiskers, and something which looked remarkably like flour, but otherwise everything seemed quite normal. Paddington looked most important as the Browns queued up with their plates. "It's a special French recipe," he explained as he served them all with generous helpings. "I found it in Mr. Gruber's cookery book." He listened with pleasure to the gasps of delight from the others as they tasted his dish. Although he'd had several goes on Mrs. Bird's stove at one time or another, it was the first time he had ever cooked anything over a campfire, especially anything quite so complicated as a French recipe. And although he'd followed the instructions most carefully, he was anxious in case he'd done something wrong. But first one, and then another of the Browns congratulated him, and even Mrs. Bird was full of praise. "I don't know what it is," she said, "but I couldn't have done better myself," which from Mrs. Bird was high praise indeed. "Delicious," said Mr. Brown. "Very, very meaty and done to a turn. In fact," he continued, as he held out his plate for a second helping, "I don't know when I've tasted anything quite so nice before. Oh, most unusual," he went on, as he wiped his plate clean with a piece of bread and looked hopefully at the saucepan once again. What was it called, Paddington?" "They're called, something, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, consulting his cookery book. "Escargots." "Escargots?" repeated Mr. Brown, dabbing his moustache. "Very nice, too, yes. We must get some of those when we're back in England. Mary?" His voice trailed away as he looked at his wife. Mrs. Brown's face seemed to have gone a rather odd shade of green. "Is there anything the matter?" he asked, looking most concerned. "You look quite ill." "Henry," exclaimed Mrs. Brown, "don't you know what escargots are?" "Oh, no. Sounds familiar, but I can't say that I do. Why?" "They're snails," said Mrs. Brown. "What?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Snails? Did you say snails?" "Crikey!" groaned Jonathan. "Snails!" "But where on earth did you get them, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown, voicing all their thoughts. "Oh, they didn't cost very much, Mr. Brown," said Paddington hurriedly, misunderstanding the look of alarm on everyone's face. "The man in the shop let me have them cheap because the shells were cracked. I think they were a very good bargain." Much to Paddington's surprise, his remark was greeted by renewed groans from the Browns, and he looked most upset at the sight of them all rolling on the grass, holding their stomachs. "To think I had a second helping," said Mr. Brown. "I'm sure I've been poisoned. There's a funny thumping noise in my head." "Did you say the man in the shop?" asked Mrs. Bird suddenly. "That's a point," said Mr. Brown as he sat up. "What shop?" Well, Paddington thought for a moment. He had been hoping to save his news of the village until after the meal as a special surprise for the Browns, and he was most disappointed at the thought of having to tell them straight away. But before he had time to answer, Mrs. Bird suddenly began waving her sunshade in the air and pointing in the direction of the hill. "Gracious me!" she exclaimed. "What on earth's going on over there?" "Good heavens! No wonder I had a thumping noise in my head," said Mr. Brown as he followed the direction of Mrs. Bird's sunshade to where an enormous tractor was coming over the brow of the hill, followed by a long line of people. "Oh, it looks like a procession of some kind." The Browns watched in fascination as the crowd grew nearer and nearer and finally came to a halt in front of them. The leader, a fat, jolly-looking man in white overalls and a tall chef's hat, bowed low in Paddington's direction. "Ah, Monsieur le Bear," he exclaimed, beaming all over his face as he held out his hand. "We meet again." "Hello, Mr. Dupont," cried Paddington, hurriedly wiping the gravy stains off his paw before offering it. "Would someone mind pinching me?" said Mr. Brown as he looked at the others. "I think I must be dreaming." "Welcome to Saint-Castille," said Monsieur Dupont, as he advanced on Mr. Brown. "Please, we have come to see the stagecoach which has lost its wheel. Monsieur le Bear has already explained to us all about the matter, and we are most anxious to help." "The stagecoach?" repeated Mr. Brown, looking more and more mystified. "What stagecoach?" Paddington took a deep breath. "I think perhaps I must have got my phrases mixed up by mistake, Mr. Brown," he said. "There wasn't a chapter on motor cars having a puncture, so I used the one on stagecoaches instead." It was a bit difficult to explain, and Paddington wasn't quite sure where to start first. "I think," said Mr. Brown, turning to Monsieur Dupont, the baker, "I think we'd better sit down. I have a feeling this may take rather a long time." Said Mr. Brown, much later that evening as they sat outside the hotel in Paddington's village, taking a nightcap before going to bed. "I'll say this for Paddington. Things may get complicated now and then, but they have a habit of turning out right in the end." "Bears always fall on their feet," said Mrs. Bird darkly. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again." "I vote we stay here," said Mr. Brown. "It wasn't on the itinerary, but I don't think we could find anything nicer." "Hear, hear," said Mrs. Bird. After all the excitement of the afternoon, everything seemed particularly quiet and peaceful. The stars were shining in a cloudless sky. The sound of gay music from a nearby cafe filled the air, and at the end of the street, leading down to the harbour, they could see the lights from the fishing boats as they bobbed up and down in the water. In fact, apart from the music, the only sound to disturb the night air was the steady scratching of the old nib on Paddington's pen, and the occasional sigh as he dipped a paw into his marmalade jar. When the Browns had discovered where Paddington bought his snails, they'd suddenly felt much better. It was a most respectable-looking shop, and Monsieur Dupont assured them it was noted for its snails. So, by popular vote, Paddington had been given the prize for the best dish of the day. After a great deal of thought and peering in shop windows, he had used the money in order to buy some stamps and 2 picture postcards, one for his Aunt Lucy in Peru and the other for Mr. Gruber. They were big postcards, 2 of the biggest he'd ever seen. All the same, there had been so many happenings that day, and some of them were so difficult to explain, he felt it was going to be a job getting them all in, even on a bargain-sized postcard.
Monsieur Dupont looked at Paddington in amazement. "You mean to say, Monsieur le Bear," he exclaimed, "that you have never before heard of le cyclisme?" "Never, Monsieur Dupont," said Paddington earnestly. "Woof!" cried Monsieur Dupont, raising his hands in the air. "Everyone should see a real bicycle race. It is most exciting. And you are indeed fortunate, for the one which is passing through our village tomorrow is the greatest of them all." Monsieur Dupont paused to let his words sink in. "It is called the Tour de France," he continued impressively. "It lasts for 20 days, and people come from all over the world to see it." Paddington listened carefully as Monsieur Dupont went on to explain what an honour it was to take part in the race, and how it would be going through the village not once, but several times. "Up the hill," said Monsieur Dupont, "round the houses, and down the hill again. In that way everyone will have a chance to see it. Why," he went on, "there is even a prize for the champion rider down the hill into the village. Think of that, Monsieur le Bear." Well, at that moment Monsieur Dupont had to serve a customer, and so, after thanking him very much for all his trouble, Paddington left the baker's shop and hurried across the square to have another look at the poster, which had aroused his interest. It was a large poster, pasted on the side of a shop, and it showed a long, winding road crowded with men on bicycles. All the men wore brightly coloured singlets, and they had very earnest expressions on their faces as they bent low over the handlebars. They seemed to have travelled a long way, for they all looked hot and tired, and one man was even eating a sandwich as he rode along. Seeing the sandwich reminded Paddington it was nearly time for his elevenses, but before he went back into the hotel for his marmalade jar, he spent some minutes with Mr. Gruber's phrase book, working out the words in small print at the bottom of the poster. There was a thoughtful expression on his face as he made his way to where the Browns were sitting outside the hotel, and several times during the next quarter of an hour he absent-mindedly dipped his paw into the cocoa by mistake, instead of into his jar of marmalade. Paddington was late arriving down at the beach that morning, and the others had already been there some time when he came hurrying across the sand, brandishing his bucket and spade, and with a look on his face of a job well done. "What on earth have you been doing, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. We were getting quite worried." "Oh," said Paddington, waving his paws vaguely in the direction of the village. "Things in general, Mrs. Brown." Mrs. Bird looked at him suspiciously. Now that he was close to, she could see several dark patches on his fur which looked remarkably like oil stains. But before she had time to examine them closely, Paddington had made off again in the direction of the sea. "You'd better not be late tomorrow, Paddington," called Mr. Brown. "It's the big cycle race. You mustn't miss that." To everyone's astonishment, Mr. Brown's words had a very strange effect on Paddington, for he nearly fell over backwards with surprise, and his face took on a most guilty expression as he collected himself and hurried into the water as fast as he could, casting some anxious glances over his shoulder. Mrs. Brown sighed. "There are times," she said, "when I would give anything to be able to read Paddington's mind. I'm sure it would be most interesting." Said Mrs. Bird darkly. "There are times when I'm sure it's much better not to. We should never have a moment's peace. He looked much too pleased with himself just now for my liking." Well, with that, the Browns settled down to enjoy themselves in the sun. With their holiday fast drawing to an end, they wanted to make the most of it, and soon Paddington's odd behaviour was forgotten for the time being. But Mrs. Brown was still worrying about the matter when they went to bed that evening. Paddington had disappeared upstairs unusually early, and now there were some strange bumps coming from his room which she didn't like the sound of at all. After spending some moments with her ear to the wall, she beckoned her husband over. "I think he must be making some marmalade sandwiches, Henry," she said. "Listen." "Making marmalade sandwiches?" repeated Mr. Brown.
I don't see how you can hear anyone make marmalade sandwiches. You can with Paddington, said Mrs. Brown. You can hear the jars going. When he's eating it, he just dips his paws in, and you can hear the breathing. But when it's sandwiches, he uses a spoon, and you can hear the clinks as well. They must be big ones, then, said Mr. Brown, vaguely, as he stood up. He's puffing away like anything. It sounds just like someone blowing up a bicycle tyre. Mr. Brown had a problem of his own at that moment without worrying about Paddington making marmalade sandwiches. He had just made the surprising discovery that his face flannel, which he'd left on the balcony outside the room to dry, had completely disappeared, and in its place someone had left a very black and oily piece of rag. It was most strange, and he couldn't for the life of him think how it could have come about. Unaware of all the interest he'd been causing in the next room, Paddington sat down in the middle of his bedroom floor, with a marmalade sandwich in one paw and a large spanner in the other. On either side of him were a number of cardboard boxes full of bits and pieces, not to mention a large oil can, a bicycle pump, and several important-looking tools. In front of him, looking as clean as a new pin, and shiny enough for him to see the reflection of his whiskers on the polished surface, stood a small three-wheeled cycle. And there was a blissful expression on Paddington's face as he took several large bites out of the sandwich and surveyed the result of his evening's work. The man in the garage had been most surprised when Paddington paid him a visit, and at first he'd been rather doubtful about hiring the machine to a bear, especially as Paddington had no references apart from some old postcards from his Aunt Lucy. But Paddington was good at bargaining, and after promising to clean the machine, he had at last won the day. The garage man had even lent him the oil can, which had proved most useful, as the tricycle had been standing outside for a number of years and was rather rusty. Luckily, he'd found a piece of cloth on the balcony outside Mr. Brown's room, and so he'd been able to clean off the worst of the dirt before getting down to the important job of taking it to pieces and polishing it. All the same, taking the tricycle to pieces had been a lot easier than assembling it again. And as Paddington finished off his sandwich, he noticed, to his surprise, that he had one or two very odd-looking parts left over in the cardboard boxes. After tying his Union Jack on the handlebars in preparation for the next day, Paddington put the remains of the marmalade sandwiches into the basket on the handlebars, and then climbed onto the saddle with an excited gleam in his eyes. He'd been looking forward to testing the tricycle, but as he moved off he soon decided that riding it was much more difficult than it looked, and he began to wish he had longer legs, with knees. But it was very hard to pedal and sit on the saddle at the same time. Apart from that, for some reason he couldn't quite make out, the machine was most difficult to stop, no matter what he pulled. Several times he ran into the wardrobe by mistake, and by the time he'd finished, there were a number of nasty tyre stains on the wallpaper as well. Once, when he rounded a corner at the foot of the bed, the chain came off, nearly throwing him over the handlebars. Well, after several more turns round the bedroom, Paddington fell off the machine and lay where he was for a few moments, mopping his brow with an old handkerchief. Riding tricycles was hot work, especially in such a small space as a hotel bedroom, and after peering at his reflection in the handlebars once or twice, he reluctantly decided to call it a day. All the same, tired though he was, Paddington found it difficult to get to sleep that night. Apart from the fact that he had to lie on his back with his paws in the air in case any oil came off on the sheets, he had a great many things to think about as well. But there was a contented expression on his face when he did finally nod off. It had been a good evening's work, and he was looking forward to the next day. Paddington felt sure that with such a bright and shiny tricycle, he would stand a very good chance indeed of winning a prize in the Tour de France cycle race. Browns were wakened earlier than usual the next morning by the comings and goings in the square outside the hotel. The village was full of important-looking men wearing armbands. There was an air of great excitement, and every few minutes a loudspeaker van passed by and addressed the crowd which had collected on the pavement round the square at the side of the hill leading out of the village. The Browns had arranged to meet on the balcony outside Paddington's room, from where there was a fine view of the hill. But to their surprise, when they gathered there, Paddington himself was nowhere to be seen. I do hope he won't be long," said Mrs. Brown. "He'll be most upset if he misses any of it." "I wonder where on earth he can have got to," said Mr. Brown. "I haven't seen him since breakfast." Said Mrs. Bird as she looked round the room. "I have my suspicions." Fortunately for Paddington, before Mrs. Bird had time to say any more, there was a burst of clapping from the crowd on the pavement below, and so the subject was forgotten as the Browns looked over the balcony to see what was happening. "How very odd," said Mrs. Brown, as the clapping grew louder, and several people cheered. "They seem to be pointing at us." The Browns became more and more mystified as they waved back at the crowd. "I wonder what they mean by Vive le Bear," said Mr. Brown. "It can't be anything to do with Paddington. He isn't here." "Goodness only knows," said Mrs. Brown. "I suppose we shall just have to wait and see." Had they but known, the Browns weren't the only ones to wonder what was going on at that moment, but fortunately for their peace of mind, there were several streets and a large number of houses between them and the cause of all the excitement. At the other end of the village, Paddington was even more puzzled at the way things were going. In fact, the more he tried to think about the matter, the more confused he became. At one moment, he'd been sitting quietly on his tricycle in a side street, peering round the corner every now and then and checking the marmalade sandwiches in the basket on his handlebars as he waited for the race to appear. The next moment, as the first of the riders came in sight and he pedalled out to join them, everything seemed to go wrong at once. Before he knew where he was, Paddington found himself caught up in a whirlpool of bicycles and shouting people and policemen and bells. He pedalled as hard as he could and raised his hat to several of the other cyclists, but the harder he pedalled and the more he raised his hat, the louder they shouted and waved back at him, and by then it was much too late to change his mind and turn back even if he'd tried. Everywhere he looked there were bicycles and men in shorts and striped shirts. There were bicycles in front of him, there were bicycles to the right of him. Paddington was much too busy pedalling for dear life to look back, but he was sure there were bicycles behind him as well, because he could hear heavy breathing and the sound of bells ringing. In the excitement, someone handed him a bottle of milk as he went past, and in trying to take the bottle with one paw and raise his hat with the other, Paddington had to let go of the handlebars. He went twice round a statue in the middle of the street before joining the stream of cyclists once more as they swept round the corner onto a road leading out of the village. Luckily the road was uphill, and most of the other cyclists were tired after their long ride, so that by standing on the pedals and jumping up and down as fast as he could, he was able to keep up with them. It was as they reached the top of the hill and rounded another corner leading back down into the village that things suddenly took a decided turn for the worse. Just as he was about to sit back on the saddle and have a rest while he got his second wind, Paddington found, to his surprise, that without even having to turn the pedals, he was beginning to gather speed. In fact, he hardly had time to wave to the crowd before he found himself starting to overtake the riders in front. He passed one, then another, and then a whole bunch. The cyclists looked quite startled as Paddington flashed by, and all the time the cheering from the spectators on the side of the road grew louder. Quite a number recognised him, and they called out words of encouragement, but by then Paddington was much too worried to notice. He tried pulling as hard as he could on the brake lever, but nothing happened. In fact, if anything, he seemed to go faster than ever, and he began to wish he hadn't used quite so much oil on the moving parts when he cleaned them. By then the pedals were going round so fast that he sat back on the saddle and hurriedly lifted up his feet in case his legs fell off. It was as he gave the brake lever an extra hard pull that he had his second big shock of the day, for it suddenly came away in his paw. Paddington rang his bell frantically and waved the lever as he overtook the last of the riders in front. "Apply your brakes, Monsieur le Bear!" yelled a man in English as he recognised the Union Jack on Paddington's handlebars. "I don't think I can," cried Paddington, looking most upset as he shot past. "My lever's come off in my paw by mistake, and I think I've left some of the bits in my box at the hotel." Paddington clung to the handlebars of his tricycle as he hurtled on down the hill towards the village square. All the villagers were most excited when they saw who was in the lead, and a great cheer went up as he came into view. But as he lifted the brim of his hat and peered out anxiously, all Paddington could make out was a sea of white faces and a blurred picture of some buildings looming up ahead, which he didn't like the look of at all. But if Paddington was worried, the Browns were even more alarmed. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "It's Paddington." "He's heading straight for Monsieur Dupont's shop," said Mrs. Brown. "I can't watch," said Mrs. Bird, closing her eyes. It was Monsieur Dupont himself who saved Paddington. Right at the very last moment, his voice rose above the roar of the crowd. "This way, Monsieur le Bear!" he cried, as he flung open the big double gates at the side of his shop. "This way!" And before the astonished gaze of the onlookers, Paddington shot through them and disappeared from view. As the rest of the cyclists sped past unheeded, the crowd surged forward and gathered round Monsieur Dupont's shop. The Browns only just managed to force their way through to the front before a gasp went up from everyone as a small white figure came into view through the doors. Even Paddington looked very worried when he saw his reflection in Monsieur Dupont's window, and he pinched himself several times to make sure he was all right before raising his hat to the crowd, revealing a small, round patch of brown fur. "I'm not a ghost," he exclaimed when all the cheering had died down. "I think I must have landed on one of Monsieur Dupont's sacks of flour." And as the crowd gathered round Paddington to shake him by the paw, Monsieur Dupont echoed the feelings of them all. "We of Saint-Castille," he cried, "shall remember for many years to come the day the Tour de France passed through our village." There was a great deal of celebrating in the village that evening, and everyone applauded when the mayor announced that he was giving Paddington a special prize with as many buns as he could manage into the bargain. "Not for the fastest rider through the village," he said, amid cheers and laughter, "but certainly for the fastest down the hill. We are very proud that someone from our village should have won the prize." Paddington felt very pleased with himself as he sat up in bed that night, surrounded by buns. Apart from having one paw in a sling, he was beginning to feel stiff after all his pedalling, and there were still traces of flour left on his fur, despite several baths. But, as the mayor had explained, it was the first time he could remember a bear winning a prize in the Tour de France cycle race, and it was something to be proud of. Well, the next morning the Browns were up early again, for it was time to start their journey back to England. To their surprise, everyone else in the village seemed to be up as well, in order to send them on their way. Monsieur Dupont was the last to say goodbye, and he looked very sad as the Browns made to leave. "It will seem quiet without you, Monsieur le Bear," he said, shaking Paddington by the paw. "But I hope we shall meet again one day." "I hope so too, Monsieur Dupont," said Paddington earnestly, as he waved goodbye and climbed into the car. Although he was looking forward to being back home again and to telling Mr. Gruber all about his adventures abroad, Paddington felt very sorry at having to say goodbye to everyone, especially Monsieur Dupont. "All good things come to an end sooner or later," said Mrs. Brown as they drove away.
And the nicer it is, the sooner it seems to end. But if they didn't end, said Mrs. Bird wisely, we shouldn't have other things to look forward to. Paddington nodded thoughtfully as he peered out of the car window. He'd enjoyed his holiday in France no end, but it was nice knowing that each day brought something new. "That's the best of being a bear," said Mrs. Bird. Things happen to bears."